There we go. I always forget to do that part. So I see there's already a couple of people here, so that's great. So what I am doing today is unboxing. I mentioned this on Friday, on Casual Friday, that I had received a package from someone in my Minnesota Knitters Guild who knew that I collect vintage patterns, and she was trying to clear some out, and she wanted to know if I wanted them, and I said sure. So I have no idea what they are. So what I thought I would do is I'm going to unbox them and we're going to look at them together. She told me some of them are in rough shape. So I'm going to unbox them, and at the same time I'm testing some new equipment I just got that's going to help me do overhead shooting when I'm doing live streams. So it's a very similar camera to what I have for my normal Casual Fridays and Technique Tuesdays, but it just couldn't work well with live streaming. And I much prefer to have a setup that's similar to what I do in my everyday recording, and so that I can zoom in and I can just have my setup the way I normally have it. So we're going to do that. I'm going to unbox that, and then so we're testing this equipment. And also I want to ask you, I think last time people were complaining that I was too quiet. So let me know. I'm going to start looking at the comments, but let me know if the volume is good for you guys, if you're hearing well. Let's see, we've got Southern California, Montreal, London, Sweden, Virginia, more California, New York, Los Angeles, UK, Germany. So many more people from outside the US than inside the US. That's funny. I tried to time this so that you guys in Europe would still be awake when we were doing this. But please let me know if the sound volume is good. Okay, good. Volume is good. All right. So I'm going to switch to the overhead so you can watch me unbox, and we'll go through this stuff. So you can see my computer in the shot. Let me see if I can. Well, you're going to see. There we go. All right, so I opened up two sides. Oh, good. Okay, so it's mostly there because I had a hard time last time getting the box open. So, oh, there's actually more in here than I thought there would be. I thought maybe there was a book in here, but I think it's just a lot of patterns. All right. Okay, so let's see what we have. The other thing that I did was I brought over a box of my hanging file folders where I keep a lot of my vintage patterns. And if you guys are interested in looking at those after we go through these, that'll be something else. So let's see. So this is 2 needle mittens. So that means knitting flat and seaming. Easy to knit 2 needle mittens by, that it said Neil Armstrong, Nell Armstrong. There's a little label right here. Let me see if I can zoom in so you guys can see this. See if you can see. It says JCPenney. I think JCPenney is still around. I don't think they've gone bankrupt, but that was a really popular department store here in the United States when I was growing up. So just basic mittens with different cable patterns in them. So that's cool. And I can see why she put it in a sheet protector because it is very fragile. So I'm going to put that back in. Oh, now the next thing is something that I love seeing, these learn how to books. I love to see how they explain knitting in different eras. So this has got knitting, crocheting, tatting, and embroidery. And this is from 1975. So they've got all kinds of little things for, it looks like mostly with, oh, there's even a sweater pattern in here. Turning the heel on a sock, making a seam. Different stitch patterns, different little projects. That's really a cool thing. Here's some more gloves and mittens to knit and crochet for the entire family. So I've got the little snowman. So I'm going to try to see if I can tell when these were published. This is 1953 on this one. So they've got different, I may have this one. You know what? I may have this one already. I am pretty sure that I do, because a lot of these look familiar to me. That's interesting. So, because I recognize this little pattern here. Scandinavian snow sets. That looks cool. All of these different. So I live in an area where there are a lot of people descended from immigrants from Northern Europe, particularly Sweden and Norway, but also Germany. So Scandinavian, like Norwegian sweaters and that sort of thing, are very popular here in this part of the country. In fact, I think it's one of the only states in the country where the most popular surnames are not Smith and Miller, that they're like, I think it's like Anderson and Johnson and things like that. Oh, knee-high stockings, caps and gloves. This one is in very good shape. So this is pretty cool. I wonder when this one was published. I can't tell when this one was published. Let's see if you guys have any comments so far. Oh, I have seen that. Somebody's asking, have I seen this book? The title makes it intriguing, women's work, the first 20,000 years. I actually talked about that one time. We have that in our textile center library, and I checked out once. I talked about it a while ago. I don't know where. Oh, this this brings me back, these kind of sweaters, these lopey sweaters. This looks like something probably from the 90s, 80s, or 80s, 90s, something like that. Reynolds Lopey. Wendy Aaron. This looks like a 1970s. The hair in these things always, and the makeup and the posing is usually, this doesn't say what year, but they've got some nice Aran sweaters in here. Those are nice. Spinnerin, I always like to see Spinnerin. Those are older. This is 1960. So, Around the World Look Fashions for All. A lot of boat neck so far. Little girl. I'd wear that. Well, that's interesting. I don't know that I like it. It is interesting, though. Let's see. These are actually in pretty good shape, these booklets. I don't think there's anything more back here. These are all the direct. Oh, wait. There's something. A coat. That would be a labor of love, wouldn't it? Another boat neck sweater. Boy, this this book has a lot of boat neck styles. Oh, look. They've got a color photo. That's a very hairy sweater. Oh, interesting. They have this V-neck that's then filled in with a cowl. Got another boat neck type of thing here. That must have been the, look at all of these boat necks. That's so interesting. So that's kind of a really interesting, and I think it said, didn't I say 1960? 1960. I wouldn't have placed that at 1960. What do you guys, you have the glove and mittens book. It must have been a really popular one. Oh, and she had the notations when she made them. That's wonderful. That's my favorite thing about the vintage patterns that my grandmother, that I got from my grandmother, because I would never knit those things, but the little notes in there. Spinnovations Idea Book, a winter garden of 44 big, bulky fashions. So this looks like late 70s to me, maybe. I wonder if there's a, a date on there. I can't tell. I'm trying to remember my childhood and when like the late 70s versus or mid to late 70s, that kind of, this kind of style reminds me of high school. I like that sweater though. You know, the men's sweaters a lot of times, actually there's quite a few in here that are pretty nice. Again, I wouldn't knit a coat like that. So some of this stuff, you know, that's always interesting to me is what like, yeah, some of this is like, not my taste, but some things are pretty cool. This is actually kind of a neat cape type of item. That I don't care for. Again, love the Aran type sweaters. My fave. This is nice. And I'll always love the cardigans. Another Spinovations. This is something I've never heard of. Oh, it's from Spinnerin. Oh, Spinnerin Spinovations. Fisherman's Forecast, fun for all weather. So that one I like. I don't know. That one's not doing it for me. Some of this is, okay, let's see. Go to the back. There's a zipper jacket. I always like the idea of those, but the idea of installing a zipper into knitted fabric is a challenge for me anyway. Some more boat necks. I don't know what the deal is with the boat necks. I like that one. So do you guys have any questions or any comments? Oh, you have that Learn to Knit book. You know, it's interesting. Wendy and Erin look... you had that hair in the 70s. It just kind of reminds me of like the Farrah Fawcett thing, the winged hairdos. Knitted seamless raglans, 9 months to size 50. So that's a big range. So they're showing all the different styles, and then they have charts. Oh, and for different yarn weights, sport weight, worsted weight. Was that the only two? Yeah, they have 2 yarn weights, and then they've got a big chart. This is kind of reminds me sort of the Ann Budd books where you use your gauge and your size, and then you follow the instructions and look on the chart to see what numbers apply to you. So they have all of the things are the ones that you see on the front, and then the ones on the back, and then in the inside they have all of the different charts for making all of the variations. That's a handy kind of thing. A lot of knitters, you know, they get comfortable knitting one type of thing, and they know they can do that, and then they mix up with the stitch patterns. Fisherman Fashions for the Family. This one is 1972. So I don't know what the tassel, oh, that's interesting. For fringe, I don't know what you'd need fringe for. So this is kind of dark. There's a grandpa and his grandkids. Oh my God. Oh no, thank you. These sweaters are nice. Let's see what else we've got. These are all in really great shape. I don't know what she was talking about. These are perfect. These photographs are kind of dark. I like that one. Oh, that's interesting. It's got a collar. And then we've got a big, I like those kind of wraparound sweaters. And then we've got some accessories on the back, including a bag. Apple Pickin' Time, ladies slip shoulder cardigan. So this is just, oh, this is something from 1989, and there's writing on it. So somebody has made this. So it's an intarsia, or I guess stranded. I guess this is really a stranded color work. And then some kind of texture at the top. So these are little apples. And then the charts. And they had 2 sizes, it looks like. Oh no, they had 3 sizes. So, okay, now we've got some really older things, it looks like. This looks like it was a very old type of photocopy. It's taped around the edge here. I'm scared to open this. Okay. So, snuggly wools for your bundle of heaven. So somebody photocopied this from a long time ago. So the classic baby bonnets and booties and little mitts. Little woolly things, bonnets and mittens. Oh, a carriage cover. So this stuff looks pretty old to me. I wonder when this is from. Do any of these things look familiar? This is Red Heart baby wool. This would have been when Red Heart was actually still wool. So this is like some old time baby. Just the illustrations are very old. Oh, these are nice little pullovers. Oh, little dinosaurs, or no, elephants. Oh, these are cute. So that's interesting. This is like a really old booklet that somebody had that they copied. I don't know if anybody recognizes this. I'm not seeing. Oh no, 1943. There's the date right there, 1943. So that's a nice old one. And put it back in the folder. Okay, what have we got here? Oh, this must be missing the cover. This looks like it's the inside of it. Ooh, so this is definitely like I'm guessing 1940s. Sometimes these old books don't have copyright information in it. Oh wait, let's see, 1947. So if anybody knows what this is, because like I said, this is missing the cover, but this says at the bottom it's just called Smart Knitting. So does anybody recognize that? Ooh, that I like. That's nice. It's the new, it says here, new torso look. It looks like they've got belts with everything. So, you know, let me zoom this back a little bit so you guys can see the spread. So, you know, the 1940 stuff I often think is really cool looking. Not that I think I could pull it off today, but I just like the way it looked. Can you imagine knitting one of these dresses? 15 stitches over 2.5, so that's 7.5 stitches an inch. That's like what I'm knitting this 1960s sweater at right now. That's going to have 100,000 stitches just in the sweater. Can you imagine how long it would take? Oh my God. Ooh. Now this is interesting. I have been thinking about some sort of a two-tone thing because one of the sweater kits that I got only has 5 balls of yarn. It's missing 3 of the balls, and I was thinking if I could come up with a contrast color, because I think it's Jameson, either Jameson's of Shetland or Jameson and Smith has a Shetland heritage yarn that's just like this type of yarn that's in those Andrew Stewart kits. And I don't, you know, and then this is calling for spinner and nylana. But anyway, I was thinking if I could get something that went with that yarn, then I could make an actual sweater. And this could be, that could be something cool. I like the contrast. I don't think so. Wow, that's some shoulder pads. Again, so much knitting for the career girl. Like she'd be making a career out of knitting that sweater. This is a really nice a jacket. I think when you get far enough away, like when it's before when you were born, then things look more interesting. When I look at the stuff from the 70s, maybe it was tacky, or maybe it's just like I grew up with that and I'm like, I don't want to do that again. So, see what you guys are saying. Love this 47 book. Oh, knitting machine. There you go. And you know, knitting machines were kind of popular in the mid-century. Like they were, like we had a knitting machine. Well, we still have a machine knitting guild here, but it's a very small number of people. But back in the day, it was like there were several machine knitting guilds here in the Twin Cities. I've looked in the newspapers, and there were tons of them. So maybe that's part of the appeal of all of these plain stockinette sweaters, is that people could take the hand knitting thing and maybe transfer it to machine knitting. That's cute. I like these. Let me zoom in on that a little bit. I'm just loving being able to play with my zoom in. Look at that. That's kind of cool. I've never seen that. And there's, it looks like a seam line. I don't know if it's a seam, but there's some kind of vertical, maybe it's a column of pearls. I don't know, but it's kind of, that's really an interesting detail. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. That's an interesting detail though. This is nice. I really like these short sleeve sweaters from the 40s. They saved on yarn, but I live in Minnesota. I need to cover my whole body, not just my upper arms. So, oh, but I like that too. I just really like these 1940s things. And now we're getting into the baby stuff, which often looks exactly the same from decade to, oh, little, I think these are crochet. Yeah, crochet little sandals here. A little squirrel, Merle the squirrel. That little pixie hat. So this is a lot of kids stuff, and then we've got the matching stuff for the family. I guess she's got ski poles. I guess they're ski sweaters. And then you've got the professor vest, and that's a nice Argyle looking sweater. A lot of Argyle stuff in here. Gifts and accessories. The hats from the 40s always crack me up because, you know, we don't wear hats like this thing right here. It's popcorn toque. Crochet made easy. They've got bag, popcorn. So now we've got, I don't know what these are. Oh, these lovely and practical designs are brought to our attention. We had no more time and no more paper. We couldn't resist them. Oh, so these are extra patterns, and you could mail away for them if you wanted those patterns. Oh, somebody cut something out. Knit for Needy Children contest. Wow, look at the prizes. Look at, I don't know if you can see this. This refrigerator, look at the way that the bottom opens up like an oven door. Is that a, oh, that's a, oh, a television radio. Look at that, you guys. A television radio with the tiny little screen at that angle. What would you have to stand in front of it in order to, like, how can you watch that? That's so interesting. I've never heard of that. Let me scoop back out again. So we've got bead loops. I don't know what this is for. Oh, for a bag. There's a bag. And so these are just like little details and things, stitch patterns. This one is really cool. I love this. I would love to know what the cover looked like, if anybody. I know those 1940s things. They're so appealing. That the thing that is always the drawback is they knit at such a fine gauge. So you really have to find something that you think you can stick with for a long time, because it's not like knitting something worsted weight. Scandinavian sweaters. This is by the same person who did that other one, along with somebody else. Titles in English and Swedish. That's interesting. I know somebody said here they were from Sweden. Okay, so this is 19. Look at this. date, you guys. 1946 by Kaisa? I don't know. It's not, that J is not a J sound. It's, I think, like an I sound. Let's see. Okay, let's look at some of these Scandinavian designs. So we've got the classic reindeer. I don't know what that's supposed to be at the bottom. I have no idea what that's supposed to be. We've got some the 8-pointed star, the Nordic star. Reindeer. Wasn't the first one reindeer? Yes, we've got reindeer. Oh, this had snowflakes, and this one's got trees, and then it doesn't have that thing on the bottom. Reindeer and pine trees. I wonder if the other one said what that was. Just said reindeer. This is interesting to me to see this from the 1940s, and then you can see the names of the Swedish names in there as well. Dancing girls and boys. Ooh, that's nice. Star jacket, all over pattern. Munkabalte, I probably pronounced that wrong. That looks like bears. Yeah, polar bears. Child's cardigan, hearts, squirrels, and that's it. And it might be, no, it's not missing. They just don't have a back cover on this. They just, or maybe there was a cover. Maybe this is the inside of it. I don't know. Well, that actually turned out to be quite a haul. I'm very, very happy with that. Let me see if you guys have any questions. Yeah, I tried. Somebody said they would try a few of the patterns. I would too. Somebody in all caps, Deborah. I would totally knit some of those 1940s outfit. I've sent several vintage patterns. I should get them out and look at them. They're so fun to look at. And the other thing is that sometimes the construction, oh, let me turn back to total face to camera. Sorry about that. I'm always, the picture in picture, I end up looking at myself in there, and I'm oblivious to what else is going on. What I think is really interesting about vintage patterns is that they often solve construction challenges in different ways than we do them today. And so we might think that, oh, they only had 1 or 2 ways of doing short rows, but they solved that issue in additional ways that we don't typically do today. And so to me, it's really interesting just to see how some things are exactly the same and how some things have a very different approach. So I don't know if you guys are interested in seeing some of my other 1940s booklets, or I can start, if you guys want to see earlier stuff, or if you would like to see mid-century things. Oh, you had the Scandinavian sweaters, but a later edition. Oh, you have all your great-grandma's things. That is so nice. I never even knew who my great-grandparents were, so that is really nice. Let's see. I'm going to show you, I'm going to switch back to overhead, and then I'm going to show you guys some of my really early century stuff, because that can be kind of interesting, I think. Okay, let me get this folder out. So this is one that I have. This is something where I thought I was ordering patterns, but what I bought was an order for patterns that was from 1909. It was like to a sweater company, and so what I bought was the order for patterns, or order for sweaters. So this is one, I have these two that are really early. This one right here is from 1901, I believe. It's the 2nd edition of the Columbia Book of Yarns. And this is Fleischer's Knitting and Crocheting Manual. And I don't remember, this is one of the early ones too. I actually have I think, the very first issue of Fleischer's, which was from like the 1880s or 90s. This one is in very good condition. And then they didn't publish another issue. This is from, I think it's from the 1893, this says 1893 down here. So they didn't publish another one for almost 10 years. So I have never been able to figure out the first Columbia Book of Yarns when that was published. But this is the second one, and it is in excellent condition. Let me back up a little bit so you can see. It's only 15 cents. Let me tell you, I paid a lot more than 15 cents. It's in such good condition, and this is not something that you can find anywhere. When I was looking in the World Catalog, there was, I think, one library maybe, or one collection somewhere that said they had it. So this has not been digitized. I haven't seen it available anywhere else. It's in really incredibly good condition. And it's not yellowed at all. It's not falling apart, and it's just slightly yellow, but it's, I don't know if it was hermetically sealed. I don't know what the deal was, but let's take a look at, so in these, for some reason, I think crocheting was just more popular. From what I understand, crocheting was maybe more popular than knitting at the beginning. So often these books would have the crochet at the beginning and the knitting at the end. This was just something that was inside of it. It's a little, from some book. Somebody cut this out. It's some embroidery pattern, I guess, and they just stuck it in this book. So these are all crochet until you get, where is the sweaters? Oh wait, here we go. Here's some sweaters. So this is a man's sweater. It has some similarities to the 1890s sweater I knit, only it's constructed in a much more sane way. But you can see how, this color down here, it's thicker. He's got that rolled up twice. So for whatever reason, they would knit their sweaters down here and then they would roll them up twice. And you just see that over and over again. And even here, like this is kind of dark, but this little kid's got his sweater flipped up. I think the little girl has hers flipped up as well. I think so. Yeah, I don't know what that was, what the deal was with that. Let me see if there's I think, oh, here we go. There's only like one sweater in here. So this is a woman's sweater right here, very form-fitting. I think there was only one sweater in this particular issue, one for each member of the family. And then there was little baby stuff, and that's it. So I just love that particular thing. Let's see if there's any more questions. Oh, it's probably on better quality paper. It could be, but like you'll see this one right here, this one from Fleischer's that I keep in here with this cardboard. This is how it shipped to me. If I were ever to use this, I would just take pictures. Well, I probably would anyway, take pictures of what I was going to knit. But this one is very fragile. They have information in here about like the mills where they produce their yarn, because these were yarn companies, and then they let's see. So they always have, how to do different kinds of stitches. And here we got a lady's outing coat. I don't know if she's like going to some game. She must be going like to a sporting event and then cheering on her team with that little flag or something. So these were early, Edwardian era, so that everything was very short and fitted to the waist, and they had that sort of S-shaped body curve. But this one, and some of these are crocheted. These two are crocheted, and this one is knit. It's got a little yoke. So, so these are fascinating to me to see these sweaters. And what's interesting also is to compare like Fleischmann's with Columbia. And when you can look at a book from the same era, and see how their construction, like one might have more simplified construction methods than the other, and the other, one's more refined, which is kind of an interesting thing to see. So then we're getting into things like shawls and golf vests and a lady's skirt. I assume that's to be worn underneath something else. And then we've got bed shoes, slippers. There's a cute little hat. I don't know what that is. Oh, it's crocheted. Ladies' leggings they could wear over your stockings. And then they've got a bunch of different Afghans in here. And then they always have baby stuff. Mittens, hats. I love this hat. And it says, I don't know if you can see here, it says brioche stitch. So brioche was really popular in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. So they did double knitting a lot. They did brioche and they did regular ribbing. And all of those were considered much warmer. And knitted items were for practical purposes to keep warm. But brioche stitch was pretty common. And there are usually like 2 or 3 different ways of how you could do it. Are listed in like knitting manuals that actually explain the stitch to you. So that's that. So I just thought it would be fun if you guys saw this really early stuff. Does anybody have any questions? Let's see. How was the cast on done for those sweaters? Maybe pulled in a weird way. It didn't look nice. No, that was just the style. Even with machine knit stuff, they just flipped them up. So and I think, my speculation has been that the sweaters were so long, they were meant to cover your rear end, and these were athletic garments. So if you were standing around outside and you weren't exerting any energy, you could maybe pull it down and cover up your rear end. But then if you were actually skating, like if you were playing hockey or if you were playing football or something like that, then you would roll it up so that you'd be able to move. That's what I feel like must have been the reason, because again, sweaters were athletic garments. That was the whole reason people were wearing them until about the 1920s. They were either just to keep warm or they were athletic garments. And then in the 1920s, you start getting into fashion and they start changing the way things are constructed, and there's a lot more variation. And in some cases, they're following dressmakers' lines with shaping armholes and things. It just depends. And then as you get into the 30s and 40s, then everything gets really fine gauge. Because before then, this stuff is usually worsted weight. It's not, I keep forgetting to go back to face of the camera. So these early sweaters, they were to keep warm. They weren't these fine gauges, which, I always heard that was what they knit at very, very fine gauges. And they did when they were knitting stockings and things like that. But when they're knitting sweaters, it was worsted weight, typically, not something that was thinner than that, because the purpose was to keep you warm. Let's see if what kind of shawls did they have? Oh, you thought brioche was something new. Let me show you something else. Let me see. Is this it? Let me show you my 1930s. Let me find. I don't have much from the 1930s, but I do have this. I've got one from the 1930s, and then I've got one from, I think, the 1940s as well. And so if you are interested in this kind of stuff and want to see some really interesting construction, I would recommend getting this book. This is Minerva Complete Knitting Manual, and this one is number 44. The other one I have is, I think, 53. So they are showing you like how to use a schematic. So they have, I don't know if these are meant to be represent half-inch squares or full-inch squares. It might be full-inch squares, but they explain how to lay something out like for a blouse. And so the back of the blouse, and this would have been fine gauge, they have various measurements, and then they tell you how to modify that, what to measure for yourself. And then the front was an inch longer and an inch wider, because they weren't using bust darts. So and these were meant to be close fitting, and so that gave you a little bit more room for your bust. And they show you how to lay out the sleeve cap. So is this the one, or is it up here? Okay. So they show you how to lay out a raglan, and they're showing you how you lay out the different pieces and showing you where the seam is and all this. But then they tell you a few pages later, knitting a raglan all in one piece. A knit-in raglan is begun at the neck. For almost all women, the rule is to cast on the equivalent of 13 inches plus 4 stitches, 1 for each seam stitch. So they're telling you how to knit a top-down raglan sweater on a circular needle. So, that's not new. The other thing that I've found really interesting, I don't know if it's in this book. Well, they show you how to finish it, how to lay it out, how to wash it, all this kind of stuff. It's really interesting to see that. So they have a lot of how-to information in this book, and then they have some very simple garments. But they show you the schematic, and then when you are measuring yourself, you can make that bigger in whichever way you want. So these are all very plain garments, but the instructions are in the schematic. So Japanese patterns are written that way, where there's a schematic for one size, and then they have arrows pointing to what you are supposed to do for different shaping. But like, for example, these underarms, they have numbers here. So they're telling you that there's 6 decreases along here. So you can see this is, you've bound off maybe an inch, and then you have another half an inch where you're doing decreases. So they're telling you how many decreases at each place, or this is 6 bind off stitches, and then there's 4 decreases over a period of 8 rows or something. But that's the whole pattern. What needle size, and then like this is the information, and there isn't a whole lot. And that was how Minerva was doing their patterns up until the 1940s, and then they switched after that. They switched away from this schematic method, but they talk about this new Minerva method of creating patterns using these types of schematics. And to me, that's fascinating, because it also taught me a lot about how to lay things out myself. I mean, I kind of was doing that anyway, but this was just an interesting way to actually lay my pattern out also with other pieces of information that could guide me, because I often use a chart when I design something myself anyway. But this stuff is I thought was really interesting. They've got and then you've got these skirt sets, and there's this like shrug thing. So they have this for every one of their patterns was using a schematic, and then this is the entire list of written instructions, and because you would have it laid out like that. So again, I think it's really informative, and if this is the kind of thing you're interested in, and especially if you're working with vintage patterns that come in one size and you need to figure out how to size it up, that is an approach that could work really well. But back to someone thought brioche was a new thing. Really, like, they figured out things a long time ago. And, oh, I know what I wanted to show you. There's another 1930s book. This one is showing how to do, these are a lot of stitch patterns. Is it in the beginning? This is like almost just like a stitch dictionary. Oh, I don't see it. It's information about fixing your, oh, here it is, knitting in sleeves. So basically, how Barbara Walker invented a short row, like a set-in sleeve top down by doing short rows. So they were already doing that, but they were doing it kind of the way that the 1890s sweater I did it, where you pick up stitches across here, and then you're knitting back and forth, and you pick up one more stitch each time as you go back and forth. it doesn't look as tidy as picking up all of them at one time. And also the way that they were picking up stitches was sort of in the middle of a stitch, like it was through the stitch rather than between the first and second stitch in, which is a tidier result. But they had figured this out back in the 1930s. Barbara Walker probably didn't have access to this, or maybe she did and thought, oh, here's a better way of doing it, and maybe she came up. But both Barbara Walker and Elizabeth Zimmerman came up with a lot of great ideas that they had never seen before, but they were pretty certain that they hadn't invented it, that somebody else somewhere probably thought of it too. And you can find the proof of that in these old patterns. Pretty interesting. Were there any knitted sideways, something like from wrist to wrist? Yes, there were. So the first antique pattern I did was also from a Columbia Book of Yarns, but it was from 1904, I think. And so there were a lot more sweater patterns in that one. And so when you look at those early days, let me switch back to face to the, whoops, there we go. Get rid of that window there. So there were a lot of different ways that they designed sweaters. And so sometimes it started at the bottom of the back and went up to the underarms and then cast on for the sleeves. And then you bound out for the sleeves and went all the way down to the bottom. So I did a 1920s sweater like that. But some of them were knit side to side. And they were coming up with a lot of ways. A lot of these, for the really basic shaped ones, when you start getting into the 1910s, they're more sort of tubular shaped sweaters, even for women. The waist became elongated, and the women were wearing corsets less because the boning, the steel boning for the corsetry was needed for making ships for World War I, and so women were not wearing those corsets anymore. They were still wearing undergarments, but they didn't have that layer of corset that kept them warm, and so they were using the sweaters longer to keep them warm. So when you have those more rectangular shapes, it's easy to kind of come at it from different angles. So they definitely did things side to side. In the 1920s, there were some really interesting things that they did because there were a lot more different shapes to sweaters as well. You see a lot more variety in the sweater styles than you have seen in earlier decades. Oh, hi, Billy. Yep, I do know it's right up your alley. The name of that book with the red cover, is it this one? This one here? This is the Columbia Manual of Knitting and Crocheting. This one I think was published in 1936. So Columbia was a yarn company. Minerva was a yarn company. Fleischer's was a yarn company here in the U.S. They were very, very big, popular companies. Eventually, Columbia and Minerva merged, I think, in the late 50s. So after that, you start seeing Columbia and Minerva rather than one or the other. So yeah, the yarn companies started merging as things progressed through the decades. But anytime, so a lot of these that are before the 1920s, you can find digitized. Not always, but a lot of times you can find them digitized and on archive.org. You can try just searching for a knitting manual, or you can try searching for like Columbia Book of Yarns or something like that. The way things are organized in that website is a little weird. So sometimes you can find knitting manuals that way that are, that somebody just uploaded, but they also have collections where maybe a library has digitized their collection and they have a particular name. So for 19th century manuals in particular, you can find one that's called the Knitting Reference Library. And then there's another one called Victorian Knitting Manuals. And those came from the collections of several well-known knitters or knitting historians in England, and so they're held by a university in England who has digitized and uploaded all of those. So you can look at a lot of 19th century manuals that way, which is probably the easiest way to get something that's a decent, in decent shape. You don't have to worry about it being fragile. And then it got trickier for me to find things in the 20th century, but once I latched onto a couple of titles, then I was able to find them. So I found them in a couple of places. eBay is one place where you can find some of those types of books, and also Abe Books here in the US. So that's sort of like all these rare and used booksellers. It's like a centralized location where you can search for things. So when I bought all of my 1940s books, once I found the names of those authors, then I could just search on Abe Books for those authors and find and look until I found the 8 different titles, and I ordered them from probably 7 different people. Most of them from the UK, because they were published in the UK, and a couple of them here in the US. So Abe Books is a good place to search by subject, and that's if you actually want to get physical copies of books. So then this other one that was read that I had, this was Fleischer's Knitting Manual. This is the first edition, so this one was in hardcover. But the Columbia Book of Yarns and the other Fleischer's books that were published after 1900 were all paperback. Do the patterns give a specific yarn to use or just a generalization? Well, the ones that are produced by a yarn company are going to tell you to use their yarn. And oh, it's very windy out. And the tricky thing about that is that they rarely tell you what gauge. They'll tell you what needle size to use, and it's so frustrating because the US did not have standardized needle sizes. Some of the companies had standardized in one way or another, but they all had their own sizes, and so every company had their own knitting needle gauge as well. So they were telling you what needle size to use, but that doesn't tell you whether or not you're going to get the gauge that they were expecting. They usually would tell you it's to fit a 36-inch bust or a 34-inch bust or 38. They'll tell you who it's supposed to fit, but they don't give you a schematic. They don't give you finished length. They don't give you finished circumference. They don't give you any of that stuff. And they just give you a needle size. And then sometimes you think, well, maybe I'll have it figured out, and they'll have 3 different sweaters all made with the same yarn. They're all calling for different needle sizes, and you don't know if that's because one of them is really supposed to be worked at a looser gauge than another, or if because some other designer, that's the needle size she used. You don't know. And then they'll use the same yarn later in the book to make something completely different, like a shawl, which needs to be looser, and you can tell it's a bigger needle. But again, you don't know the gauge. And then slippers on a very tiny needle. And again, you don't know the gauge. So that's one of the real challenges to anything before about the 1930s, is that they do start to give you stitch gauge, but they never give you row gauge. And sometimes the pattern is dependent. They'll tell you to work a specific number of rows or a number of repeats of the pattern, but they don't tell you how long that's going to be. So that can be really frustrating. So I would say if you were interested in doing vintage knitting, I would start, unless you like a challenge like me, like oh, I'm gonna try to figure this out. Or if you don't care if it fits, you just want to work your way through the pattern, which is what I did for the first thing. I wanted approximately what the yarn weight was, and I just used the needle I thought was appropriate, and I just knit it. And I followed the instructions exactly. I wasn't trying to modify anything. I just wanted to figure out how this worked. So depending on what it is that you're trying to do, once you get into like the 1950s, they start having 3 sizes at least. So that helps. And they tend to give you the gauge and the finished measurements and the schematics, and sometimes the schematic, not always, but at least they give you finished length of different, like they'll tell you how long the sleeve is and how long the sweater is, and they'll tell you how big around it is. So that can be, or they'll tell you who it's supposed to fit, and you can tell from the gauge how big around it's going to get. But it gets more challenging the further back you go, particularly because it's hard to sometimes know what those yarns were like. When did knitting gauge become commonly included in patterns? I don't know for sure. I can tell you, like when I did my 1920s sweater, there's the booklet. They listed all of it was a yarn company. They listed all their yarns and what they were like, and then they would tell you what gauge to knit it at. And they didn't tell you the row gauge. So they would tell you the gauge, stitch gauge in the 1920s. Sometimes earlier on, they would give a pattern in one size, and then they would tell you, oh, well, if you want to make it bigger, add another 5 stitches for each inch bigger you want it. And so then you're like, oh, okay, now I know the stitch gauge. So that you get a hint that way. But I would say it was probably 1930s is when I know for sure they actually explicitly mentioned stitch gauge. But I haven't seen every pattern, and I haven't seen a lot of 1930s patterns. I've seen some. So the later in the decade, and a presentation I saw a couple of weeks ago seemed to indicate that World War I was when a lot of women first learned to knit because they were knitting for soldiers. And so it was after that they started giving more information about explicitly saying what to do. So it could be that after World War I is the answer, when they started giving more information. How did anything ever fit? Well, I think they would know how something was supposed to fit. They would know what their proportions were. Like when I was knitting this Edwardian sweater and it was for a 36-inch bust, I didn't know how a garment for a woman with a 36-inch bust would fit in that era. They would have known because they would have had all their clothes made. So they would have known how big something would have been, and they probably would have had and then they could have figured out or extrapolated from there a little bit better. But I imagine a lot of people weren't very happy when I read the newspaper articles about people knitting for soldiers and the Red Cross volunteers who were in charge of evaluating all the socks that were being sent in or the sweaters. There were a lot of complaints about the things weren't the right size or they weren't knit correctly. So there were plenty of people who weren't very good knitters. There were certainly people who were expert, and they were particularly expert at what they did all the time. Like they knew how to knit socks for their family, they knew how to knit a basic sweater, they knew how to do certain basic things and how they wanted it to fit, and they knew what their gauges were. And so they could kind of figure things out. And then there's going to be people who gave up, just like people do today. So I think we have a skewed idea about that everybody knew how to do certain things, and that wouldn't have necessarily been true. And particularly in the US, it was not part of a girl's education to be taught knitting. Like in Europe, that was part of the curriculum. That was not the case here. And we certainly had home ec class in high school here as an option, but it was not something that was part of the curriculum like it was in many countries. I'm wondering if there was more standardization of knitting style back then, everybody knitting English or continental. Well, those curriculum, like my friend Ole Petter in Sweden, he grew up in different countries, whatever his dad did. I don't know what his dad did, but he grew up in different countries, and he had nannies who were from different countries, and they taught him to knit, and they all knit in different ways. By the time he got back to Sweden, when he was like 10 years old or 11 years old, he did not knit the way everybody in Sweden knit. They had standardized the curriculum like the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And so they standardized the curriculum, and knitting was part of it. And whoever wrote that knitting book decided this is how everybody's going to learn to knit. So everybody learned to knit that way. So, but you can read, like there's a book on Danish traditional sweaters. Those are really some of the earliest things that we would call sweaters, like upper body garments for common people that were knit in wool rather than silk brocade knitted things for royalty. And there was information in that book that talked about a pastor who was, or a man who was traveling and visiting a pastor and staying with his home, and they were all sitting out in the garden, and there were 3 women in the household who were knitting. One was the servant, one was the lady of the house, and one was somebody else, and they all knit in a different way. And he was taking notes about which method was the most efficient, which, when you have 3 different people each knitting a different knitting style, it doesn't mean that they have the most efficient way of knitting in that knitting style. But it was interesting to see that there was maybe more variety, and maybe it would have been more regional, like however your family did it, that's how you learned, but that doesn't mean that's how the family up the road necessarily learned. So I think these school curriculum really had an impact on how people knit in different regions of the world. And in the US, we are a country of people who came from a lot of different, mostly European backgrounds early on. And then, so like my grandmother's family she's of German descent, and I've seen photos of her. She held the yarn in her left hand because her family was German or of German descent. But other people, I've seen another, like my 3rd great grandmother, I have a photograph of her where she's holding her knitting needles, and I can't even tell what her knitting style was. Like I can't tell what was going on with her, because she wasn't actively knitting, she was holding her knitting, so I don't know. Someone's always distracted by the knits in a movie. I'm distracted by the person sitting in front of me wearing a sweater, and then the lights go out, and then I'm distracted by what's going on in the movie. Did the vintage yarn labels perhaps include the gauge? Even the yarn I got that's from the 1960s did not include gauge information on it. I only know what gauge based on the pattern that came with 2 of the kits. The other one, I just know it's a 4-ply yarn, and I compared it to a bunch of sock yarns I have. I'm like, definitely this is the same type of thing, and so it's probably needs to be knit at 7.5 stitches per inch. So a lot of yarns were more standardized. There was like everybody had a Shetland floss, everybody had this type, everybody had a that type, and so you knew what that was. Whereas nowadays, fingering weight yarn or something that people call a 4-ply could have various thicknesses. So there's less standardization now. There was more then, so it would be clearer what it was that you were getting, and you would know more about what needle size you would need to use and all of that. Not sure if you've seen your social media feeds, but Glasgow Women's Library have an online talk on the 17th of March looking at their knitting pattern archive. Ooh, that is, I wonder if that's part of the thing that's March 14th to 20th. That's part of that Textiles from the Home. I'll have to look into that. Okay, I'm going to quickly look through, and then it's been an hour, so I'm going to quickly look through and see. I thought this was going to be a quick live stream, but let me go back and see if there's questions. Let's see. Okay, I'm probably missing something. The 40s dresses are beautiful. You guys are interested in the shawls. Maybe I'll do that another time. I tend to not. I'm tending to always look for the sweaters and socks, and so I kind of skim over the shawls. But I promise I will look at those at some point. Somebody said women were domesticated and were taught to sew, knit, and cook, and would work to the wearer's men. Well, again, they may have been taught, they may not have enjoyed it, and may not have done it if they could get away with it. My grandmother grew up on a farm in Iowa, and there were 3 girls. Their little brother came along quite a bit later, and she was her father's boy. She was the middle daughter. She was very strong. She became a competitive swimmer and was training for the Olympics. She was very strong. And she used to drive her mother crazy because her mother would tell her, try to teach her how to make a cake. Well, get a cup and do a cup of sugar and a cup of butter. Well, what size of a cup? Well, and she would have all these questions, and her mother's like, go help your father. So my grandmother, her entire life, was a terrible cook, hated to cook, just terrible. And she did learn to knit and crochet, but then they moved to Southern California, and she was a full-time school teacher for her entire working life. And so there was no need for her to knit. When she retired, and her only daughter, my mother, moved to Iowa where it was cold, my grandmother, when she retired, started knitting and crocheting. That's why all of the vintage patterns I have from her are from the 60s and 70s, because she didn't start knitting and crocheting until then. She never took up cooking. So she did sew, and she often sewed her own clothes. And my mother learned to sew as well, and because my mother was very tall and skinny. And so that was something that they did. And my grandmother, I think, was pretty good at sewing. And it was less expensive to sew than it was to buy clothing. And so there was some advantage to sewing. So my grandmother learned some things and used them her whole life. And there were other things that she never did. So, I think we all have stories of a grandmother or a mother who hated to cook and, cooked out of cans, or it was terrible. So, okay. So I am going to wrap it up, and I thank you all for joining me. I thought this was really fun, and thank you for your questions. And I will see you on Tuesday for Technique Tuesday. Bye-bye.